Yes, so we're following on in the book of Acts today, and for those who haven't found it yet, it's on page 1592. So Acts chapter 25, verses 1 to 22. 3 days after arriving in the province, Festus went up to from Caesarea to Jerusalem. When the chief priests and the Jewish leaders appeared before him and presented the charges against Paul, they requested Festus, as a favour to them, to have Paul transferred to Jerusalem, for they were preparing an ambush to kill him along the way. Festus answered, "Paul is being held at Caesarea, and I myself am going there soon. Let some of your leaders come with me, and if the man has done anything wrong, they can press charges against him there." After spending 8 or 10 days with them, Festus went down to Caesarea. The next day he convened the court and ordered that Paul be brought before him. When Paul came in, the Jews who had come from Jerusalem stood around him. They brought many serious charges against him, but they could not prove them. Paul made his defence. "I have done nothing wrong against the Jewish law or against the temple or against Caesar." Festus, wishing to do the Jews a favour, said to Paul, "Are you willing to go up to Jerusalem and stand trial before me there on these charges?" Paul answered, "I am now standing before Caesar's court, where I ought to be tried. I have not done anything wrong to the Jews, as you yourself know very well. If, however, I'm guilty of doing anything deserving death, I do not refuse to die. But if charges brought against me by these Jews are not true, no one has the right to hand me over to them. I appeal to Caesar." After Festus had conferred with his council, he declared, You have appealed to Caesar. To Caesar you will go." A few days later, King Agrippa and Bernice arrived at Caesarea to pay their respects to Festus. Since they were spending many days there, Festus discussed Paul's case with the king. He said, "There is a man here whom Festus left as a prisoner. When I went to Jerusalem, the chief priests and the elders of the Jews brought charges against him and asked that he be condemned. I told them that it is not the Roman custom to hand over anyone before they have faced their accusers and have had an opportunity to defend themselves against the charges. When they came here with me, I did not delay the case, but convened the court the next day and ordered the man be brought in. When his accusers got up to speak, they did not charge him with any of the crime I had expected. Instead, they had some points of dispute with him about their own religion and about a dead man named Jesus, whom Paul claimed was alive. I was at a loss how to investigate such matters, so I asked if he'd be willing to go to Jerusalem and stand trial there on the charges. But when Paul made his appeal to be held over for the emperor's decision, I ordered him held until I could send him to Caesar. Then Agrippa said to Festus, "I would like to hear this man myself." He replied, "Tomorrow you will hear him." This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks very much, Lynn. Morning all. My name's Mark, one of the ministers here. It's great for us to be able to open up this passage together today. Now, all of us face learning curves as we go through changes in life. We all face learning curves of different kinds. Maybe you've faced a learning curve just in the normal course of life. Maybe you've had to learn how to use a new computer, a new phone, a new car that's different from the one you're used to. Anyone been through that recently? Maybe you faced a learning curve as you've come to start a new job, working in a new area that you've never worked in before, or starting a new role in a new company, maybe with a new team that you've never worked with before, maybe with a new set of tasks and expectations that you've never had before, and you're on learning curve in that way. And maybe you faced a learning curve as you've come to a new stage of life. You've become a parent or a grandparent, an uncle, an auntie. And if you've never had that role or that responsibility in your family before, then there's lots to learn. The learning curve in these roles never ends, really, does it? And as we've been through learning curves, we know that it's not easy. I was speaking to someone this week who'd started a new job recently, and they spoke of feeling like an imposter. I've heard other people talk about fake it till you make it. That's what we want to do when we're faced with a learning curve, isn't it? When we're in a role, we're expected to know what we're doing, so we act like we know what we're doing, even while we're very clearly still on the learning curve. I remember when I got my first job in retail, I put on the company name tag, and suddenly people would treat me like an expert. They'd ask me what size suit or shirt they should buy without trying it on. And they'd ask me which tie would match which shirt colour. And they'd ask me detailed questions about the uniform requirements and rules at their child's school. And I had no idea. Name tag or not, I was on the learning curve. Now, in our passage today, we meet a newly appointed Roman governor, a guy named Porcius Festus. And I'm sure that his friends at school were kind and never took advantage of his unfortunate name. But through the passage, we see Porcius Festus on the learning curve, learning about Paul and Jesus and learning about justice. Now, we first heard about Festus at the end of the rule of Felix. In the last verse of the last chapter, we were told that it had been 2 years since Paul's trial before Felix. And after those 2 years, Felix is succeeded by Festus. And we immediately see the difference between them. While Felix had been in the role of governor in the region for several years, Festus is brand new. As we heard during Paul's trial before Felix, Felix knew how things worked in this region. But Festus is just starting out. He has the same role, the same authority, the same rule as Felix. But he appears to know almost nothing about Paul or about Jesus. And so from the start of his rule, we're shown that he's very much on the learning curve about both. First, let's look at Festus and his learning about Paul, learning about Jesus. Look with me at chapter 25, starting at verse 1. 3 days after arriving in the province, Festus went up from Caesarea to Jerusalem, where the chief priests and the Jewish leaders appeared before him and presented the charges against Paul. They requested Festus, as a favour to them, to have Paul transferred to Jerusalem, for they were preparing an ambush to kill him along the way. Now, if you've ever started in a new role, you might imagine what this would be like. Festus, he's been on the job for 3 days, and he goes on what you call an orientation tour. He gets a sense of the lay of the land. He checks into the cities. He presses the flesh with the people he's now responsible for. Felix arrives in Jerusalem, and what do we see? Well, he's presented with a problem left by his predecessor, the problem of Paul. Jewish power brokers, the chief priests, the leaders, they knock on his door and they introduce Festus to this problem. Paul, who is under Felix's protection, is still a prisoner in Caesarea, and Paul remains there in prison right now. And then, without Paul present, the Jewish leaders put forward their case against Paul. They asked Festus for a favour, for one of his first acts as governor to be the transfer of Paul to Jerusalem. Now, from the point of view of the Jews, Festus coming to power is an opportunity for a power play. They're giving Festus an easy way to score points with them, an easy way to win their favour, to keep the peace with the Jewish people under his rule. But at the start of the learning curve, maybe Festus is a bit slow. He passes up on this Jewish power play. He doesn't come to the party with Paul's transfer. For Festus, the problem with Paul is just practical. So Felix proposes a practical fix. Verse 4, Festus answered, "Paul is being held at Caesarea, and I myself am going there soon. Let some of your leaders come with me, and if the man has done anything wrong, they can press charges against him there." Simple. So the Jewish leaders do that. They follow Festus back to Caesarea. In verse 6, Festus convenes the court. He orders that Paul be brought before him. Verse 7, Paul comes in, Jewish leaders stand around him, and they bring many serious charges against Paul, but cannot prove them. Now, while this might be Festus's first rodeo with the Jewish leaders, as readers of Acts, we've seen it all before. Paul's been on trial before the Jewish religious council, the Sanhedrin in Jerusalem. He's faced their accusations. And Paul's faced and defended himself against Jewish accusations before the Roman governor here in Caesarea. This has all happened previously, right here, even in the same place. But the things highlighted for us here are the things that are new to Festus. You can imagine what went through Festus' mind when the Jews asked him for a favour. Paul's been in prison for 2 years under Felix, and the Jews' first request is this favour. Then how bad must Paul be? How long and colourful must Paul's record of rebellion against Rome be? How many capital crimes could he possibly have committed? But then when Festus hears the charges against Paul, when he learns about Paul, and when he learns about Jesus, he sees that things are a bit different. Because he learns that the problem with Paul is just a Jewish religious dispute, a dispute about Jesus. Festus shares with King Agrippa what happened later in the passage. In verse 18 and 19, this is what Festus says. When that's Paul's accusers, got up to speak, they did not charge him with any of the crimes I had expected. Instead, they had some points of dispute with him about their own religion and about a dead man named Jesus, who Paul claimed was alive. This is the problem that turned the Jews against Paul, that led them to ask for a favour, that led them to want Paul dead. It wasn't a capital crime. It wasn't rebellion against Rome. It wasn't even breaking the Jewish law or defiling the temple. It was Paul's claim about Jesus. And when it comes to Jesus, Festus is at the start of the learning curve. This is what makes Festus so different from Felix before him. Remember, in the previous chapter, Felix was well acquainted with the way. In other words, Christianity. As governor of Judea for several years, he'd come into regular contact with Christians, with their beliefs. And Paul made Christ known to him on top of that, speaking about faith in Jesus to Felix. Paul unpacked the need for faith in Christ Jesus by talking about righteousness and self-control and the judgment to come. That's what we saw last week. But through his description of Paul's belief, Festus appears to know next to nothing about Christianity before the trial. And through the trial, Jesus Christ is in some way made known to Festus. At the end, he still doesn't know much about Christianity, but he has learned this. It's about a dead man named Jesus who Paul claims is alive. As we've seen in previous chapters, resurrection has always been the key issue for Paul. Before the Roman commander, Paul spoke about his encounter with the risen Jesus on the Damascus Road. And before the Sanhedrin, before Felix, Paul said, "It's concerning the resurrection of the dead that I'm on trial before you today." And based on what Festus says, it seems that Paul's defense here also related to the resurrection, to Jesus' resurrection from the dead. And this appears to be a brand new idea for Festus. Now, seeing the learning of Festus, it's helpful for us to notice as we seek to make Christ known, because it's likely that some of the people who we want to make Christ known to will be like Festus, will be people who know very little about Jesus, people who have little experience with actual Christian belief, people who don't have a background of church attendance, who haven't attended Christian schools or sat in scripture classes, people who haven't picked up a Bible and read it, people who might celebrate Christmas and Easter with no knowledge of what they're about, people who have little idea of who Jesus really is, what he's done, what that means for them. Now, this is the story for my sister-in-law, Amelia. Amelia lives with my brother and their son in Wuhan in China, and she's been part of our family for maybe 5 years. And she's been one of Kylie's Making Christ Known names for most of that time. But it's become clear as we've gotten to know Amelia that there is no Christian understanding in her background. And it's been both a joy and a challenge to speak about our beliefs with her, to introduce her to God, to speak about Jesus. And it's been a joy because everything we share about Jesus is new and interesting and often puzzling to her. But it's also a challenge because we assume so much. We're used to speaking about Christianity with Christians, which means our starting point for speaking is here when she's all the way back here. Now, sometimes people tell me they need to be able to understand the Bible better to speak about Jesus, or they want more training in evangelism before they can speak about Jesus. And I'm sure those things are good and worthwhile. I'm sure they're helpful for our confidence. But speaking about Jesus doesn't have to be complex. No matter how much we know about the Bible or how long we've been believers, we never do it as experts. Instead, we prayerfully seek to meet people where they are on the learning curve about Jesus, about what he's done for them. And considering the season that we're in, it might be as simple as asking what people understand about Easter. And after listening to them, sharing your belief about Easter, that it's about a dead man named Jesus who is now alive. Now, sure, there are more things that can be said, more questions that would need to be asked and answered. There's more to the gospel than that. But it's a step. And it's a step that easily leads to asking if they're interested in learning more, in hearing, in reading more about what you've shared, in learning more just like you and I did before we came to know and trust Jesus. Now, after seeing Festus on the learning curve about Paul and about Jesus, let's look now at Festus learning about justice. And what we see is that Festus learning about justice relates to the request for a favour. Our request back in verse 3, remember, is to have Paul transferred to Jerusalem. What we see at first is that while Festus is a learner in some areas, he gets how justice is meant to work. He gets how justice is meant to come through the Roman legal process. And he says later to King Agrippa in verse 16, it's about getting the right people together, getting Paul in front of his accusers, giving Paul a chance to defend himself. And this is seen in his response to the Jews' request for a favour. If the Jewish leaders want Paul to be charged, then Felix doesn't need to do them a favour. He doesn't need to transport Paul to Jerusalem. They can just come to Caesarea where Paul already is, where Festus is already headed. Justice can be easily done there. But justice isn't what the Jewish leaders wanted when they asked Festus for a favour. As readers of Acts, we know that getting a favour from Felix, it's not about justice. It's not about getting the right people together. It's not about getting Paul in front of his accusers or giving him a chance to defend himself. Remember what we read at the end of verse 3? They requested Festus as a favour to them to have Paul transferred to Jerusalem. Why? For they were preparing an ambush to kill him along the way. With Festus coming to power, it's a perfect opportunity for the Jews to deal permanently with Paul. That's why they petitioned for this prisoner transfer. Because to the Jews, it's not good enough for Paul to be imprisoned. For the problem of Paul to be solved, he must be put to death, which fits with what we also find out later in the passage as Festus speaks with King Agrippa. In verse 14, Festus says, "There is a man here whom Felix left as a prisoner. When I went to Jerusalem, the chief priests and the elders of the Jews brought charges against him and asked that he be condemned." The favour isn't just to have Paul transferred from one place to another. It's for Paul to be handed over by the Romans, condemned by Roman law as a criminal who deserves to die. And with this goal in mind, with the request for a Jewish favour still in play, Festus does hold the trial in Caesarea. And just like in the previous trial before Felix, no charges are proven. Paul has done nothing wrong. As Paul himself says in verse 8, "I've done nothing wrong against the Jewish law or against the temple or against Caesar." And this has been the consistent testimony in all of Paul's trials. Paul has done nothing deserving death or imprisonment under Roman law. And he's done nothing wrong against the Jews, against the Jewish law or the Jewish temple. But something changes for Festus during the trial. Something changes in his view of justice. At the start, the problem of Paul was meant to be solved through judicial process, through charges, defence, decisions. But as Festus has gone further in the learning curve, he's learned that justice isn't so simple. And we can see the result. Verse 9, Festus, wishing to do the Jews a favour, said to Paul, "Are you willing to go up to Jerusalem and stand trial before me there on these charges?" Now, seeing this learning curve of Festus, from clarity about justice to complexity, compromise, it reminds us that this is often how human justice can work. It's like what we've seen happen to Jesus at his own trial. In Luke chapter 23, Jesus stood before the Roman governor of Judea, Pontius Pilate. Pilate had Jesus on trial at the request of the Jewish leadership, the elders, the chief priests, the teachers of the law. And after hearing the accusations against Jesus, in Luke 23:14, Pilate announced, "You brought me this man as one who was inciting the people to rebellion. I have examined him in your presence and have found no basis for your charges against him. He has done nothing to deserve death." Sound familiar? But the crowd there weren't satisfied with this decision. They wanted Jesus dead. And in Luke 23:23, we read that with loud shouts, the Jewish crowd insistently demanded that he be crucified, and their shouts prevailed. So Pilate decided to grant their demand. He surrendered Jesus to their will. As people who live in this world, we hope for justice. And we care about justice because God does, because God is just. But we also see through people like Festus and like Pilate that justice isn't as simple as it should be, as we wish it would be. And as we live in the real world, we can't expect to always see justice being done because of the complexity of people, the complexity of power. And we can't be surprised when we don't see justice being done. But we can thank God when we do see it. We can thank God when wrongdoing is proven and punished, when those impacted by wrong are set right, when they're restored as much as they can be, when good is recognised and rewarded. We thank God. But what does it mean for us when it comes to justice in the here and now? Do we just give up on seeking justice? Well, based on what Paul shows us, the answer is no. It's justice that Paul seeks. Justice for the sake of Jesus. In verse 10, Paul answers Festus, "I am now standing before Caesar's court, where I ought to be tried. I have not done any wrong to the Jews, as you yourself know very well. If, however, I am guilty of doing anything deserving death, I do not refuse to die. But if the charges brought against me by these Jews are not true, no one has the right to hand me over to them. I appeal to Caesar." Do you see what Paul is saying here? He wants justice, even if it goes against him. He's for the judicial process, even if it convicts him. If he was found guilty of a crime deserving death, he wouldn't fight the process. He doesn't refuse to die. But Paul knows just as well as Festus that he's not guilty of anything deserving death. He hasn't been convicted of any serious crimes against Rome that would receive that kind of punishment. And because the charges brought against Paul by the Jews aren't deserving of death and aren't true, then justice won't be done by handing Paul over to them. Justice won't be done by putting Paul on trial in Jerusalem. But notice what Paul does next. He appeals to Caesar. He takes hold of his rights as a Roman citizen to escalate his case to a higher court, a court which happens to be in Rome. And this reminds us that for Paul, there are bigger priorities even than the judicial process. Paul's priority isn't just to see justice done. It's not just to be found innocent. It's not just to be set free. Paul's priority is to testify about Jesus in Rome, just like Jesus told him that he would. Remember Acts 23:11? Remember Jesus' words to Paul? "Take courage, as you have testified about me in Jerusalem, so you must also testify in Rome." Now, Paul's seeking justice like this reminds us that our frame of reference isn't just what we see in this world. It's not just personal justice. As we saw last week in Paul's interactions with Felix, we know that true justice is to come, because true justice will be brought by the risen Jesus at his return. And justice from Jesus will be justice that doesn't rely on favours, that's not affected by the complexity of people, that's not influenced by power. And when future justice from Jesus is our frame of reference, then what does that do for us seeking justice now? What does that do to our heart for justice now? Well, on the one hand, I think it means we can still seek justice now when we are wronged. I've heard plenty of people, even recently, who've been scammed out of money. Should they seek justice about that? Should they go to their bank, seek reimbursement, insurance? Of course they should. But at the same time, our desire for seeking justice in the here and now is a little bit different. We don't just seek justice for our own benefit, just to maintain the freedoms that we've been given. Instead, we seek the kind of justice that helps us to make Christ known to people. And as we come to the end of this passage, as we continue to move through Acts, that's what we continue to see Paul doing. While Festus has been on a learning curve about Paul and Jesus and justice, and it's been a real learning curve for him, Paul's appeal to Caesar lets him continue to do what he's always been doing, continuing to speak about Jesus to Festus and soon enough to King Agrippa. And Paul's appeal to Caesar leads him closer to making Christ known in Rome, to testifying about Jesus in Rome. Now, as we seek to make Christ known to learners like Festus, as we seek to have a heart for justice that helps us to make Christ known in the here and now, we need God's help in these things, don't we? We're going to sing together. We're going to make the next song our prayer. We're going to sing together Undivided. And this is what we will sing. Undivided, I want to live for you. Single-minded, all that I say, all that I do. Sanctify me, take me and make me new, that I might live for Christ my Lord. Undivided, counting my gains as loss. Single-minded, whatever the pain, whatever the cost. Sanctify me, help me to take up my cross and live for him who died for me. Let's stand, let's sing together.